Good evening. This is St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander, and welcome to step 99 of our walking tour through the Bible. And this is, we're going to be considering a long passage, which is a narrative that goes from the 14th chapter of the second book of Samuel all the way through to the 20th chapter of the book of Samuel. And it is essentially the story of Absalom's revolt against his father. Now, if you remember where we'd got to, Absalom has murdered his brother in revenge for his sister's rape, and then he has fled to his grandfather's court in Geshur, and there he could have stayed. But of course, King David, who mourns the death of Amnon, also mourns the absence of Absalom. He seems utterly besotted with both his sons. He's got lots of children, of course. He doesn't seem to realize that leaving Absalom where he is probably the best outcome. He doesn't have to execute him. He doesn't have to imprison him. He can just leave him in self-imposed exile. But Joab, who is the cousin of Absalom and David's nephew, negotiates Absalom's return. Absalom returns, but is not received by the king. And then eventually they are reconciled, and Absalom is received by the king. So Absalom is then taken back into royal favor. Now, then Absalom begins his plot to overthrow King David. Now, it's by no means clear why Absalom wants to revolt against his father. His father has given him everything. Why, therefore, should he want to overthrow his father? Well, he's got everything, but everything's never enough. He wants more. Maybe it's ambition, vaulting ambition. He wants to be king. Well, I mean, he could just wait. Maybe then when King David is dead, he'd become king. But no, he can't wait. Maybe it's vaulting ambition. Maybe it's simply vanity. And I think this is what is hinted at in this extraordinary passage we have, chapter 14, 25 to 27, about the cutting of Absalom's hair. Now, in all Israel, there was no one more praised for his beauty than Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, he could not be faulted. When he cut his hair, he shaved it once a year because his hair got too heavy. He would weigh the hair 200 shekels, king's weight. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter called Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. This cutting of the hair, it just seems so strange, doesn't it? That's only the second haircut we've met in the Bible. The first one was, of course, the tricky haircut that Samson got at the hands of the Philistines when he was asleep in Dalilah's lap. So this hair, this cutting of the hair and the weighing of the hair and so on and so forth, it's very, very strange. It seems to me that Absalom is not just a playboy, he's also vain, and he's susceptible to immense flattery. And then, of course, you see Absalom's rebellion is actually not just Absalom, it's also Achitophel. Absalom and Achitophel, remember, is the famous poem by Dryden. But we don't know anything about Achitophel, who is David's counselor. But he is the person, I would imagine, reading between the lines, who puts Absalom up to his revolt. But King David fleeing Jerusalem and then eventually crossing the Jordan to get away from Absalom, King David leaves Hushai behind, who is another counselor, and Hushai acts as a double agent. He gives advice to Absalom about what to do and what not to do, which overrules Ahithophel's advice. So Ahithophel goes home and hangs himself. Achitophel dies of chagrin because he has engineered this coup, and yet his advice has not been followed, and he is so offended by this that he goes and hangs himself. Absalom's people are defeated in the forest, and then King David is able to return, not in triumph, because Absalom is killed in battle. In fact, Absalom is killed by Joab, who is the very man who brought Absalom back from exile. Joab, who is his cousin. Absalom's hair is caught in a tree. Joab runs him through, and he's buried in the forest. And of course, all the people who acted out whatever part they acted in this strange episode get their comeuppance. So, for example, sometimes they're quite innocent people. So, for example, King David left 10 concubines behind to look after the palace. These 10 concubines are forced to sleep with Absalom as his way of taking over the palace in the full light of day in a tent on the roof. It's extraordinary. King David has them imprisoned when he comes back. They're like widows of a living man. He'll never see them again because they've been defiled in this way, which is rather cruel. And then, of course, you've got Meribal, who is the real heir to the throne, who, because he thinks Absalom's revolt is going to be in his favour, shows his true colours and then is humiliated when King David comes back. And then you've got Shimei, the man who cursed King David as he was leaving Jerusalem as a man of blood, that phrase which was so memorably applied to Charles Stuart, that man of blood, King Charles I. And he is forgiven, but his comeuppance will come later in the time of King Solomon. So King David is reinstated, but he's briefly lost the throne. And when he's briefly lost the throne, all these people behave the way they behave. But King David gets the throne back. But of course, it was King David's fault in the first place that he almost lost the throne, because he'd been far too tolerant of Absalom. And even later, when Absalom is killed, gets what he deserves. King David laments the fact that Absalom is dead. And notice the way they send the news to King David. He'd killed the person who gave the news about King Saul, and so they step by step break it to him very, very carefully that Absalom is dead. And the king then went up to the room over the gate, this is chapter 19, and burst into tears as he wept. He kept saying, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. It's only if I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So King David's reaction is completely hysterical. He has really what is a breakdown. And Joab, word was brought to Joab, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the entire army that day, victory was turned to mourning, the troops having learnt that the king was grieving for his son. That day, the troops came furtively back into town, like troops creeping shamefacedly away when deserting in battle. The king covered his face and kept crying aloud, "My son Absalom, oh Absalom, my son, my son." Joab went inside to the king and said, "Today you've made all your servants feel ashamed." So Joab, being the commander-in-chief of the army, the only person who can speak to King David in this way, rebukes him for this. And how indeed are the sons who haven't revolted meant to think? How indeed are the loyal people meant to think when the traitor is given such consideration? What consideration has King David given to his friends? He seems to love his enemies, but not his friends. Anyway, the king got up and took his seat at the gate. He does pay some attention to what Joab says. King David, in this account, seems to be a broken and rather pathetic man, a man of very poor judgment, a man who is punished by his beloved son, the person he loved, not loving him back, wanting him killed, as a matter of fact, because it's clear from Absalom's conspiracy that he is going to have King David killed. Absalom is threatening to have his father killed. In fact, that is very, very clear when it says over here, Absalom's rebellion, when 4 years had gone by, Absalom said to the king, etc. When you hear the trumpet sound, you are to say, "Absalom is king at Hebron. With him went about, etc., and Gilo and so on." But it makes it clear that only the king, King David, will be killed, and it's in fact a coup. So Absalom has no second thought about killing King David, but King David makes a huge fuss over the killing of Absalom, even though it was presumably quite necessary. So King David's judgment really does seem to be in question here. Well, the rest of the second book of Samuel is just a collection of a few things about King David, none of which are, well, there are a few things that are interesting, which we'll look at later. Okay, all the very best. We'll leave this sad story behind us. Bye.